Okay, hello everyone. We are at the top of the hour, so we are going to go ahead and get started with this webinar. Thank you all for attending. This is the BASF Surviving the Summer Heat, Practical Weed and Disease Control Strategies for Nursery Ornamentals webinar. Thank you so much to our speakers. We have our guest speaker, Dr. Chris Marble, who is an Associate Professor of Horticulture at the University of Florida in the Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences, Mid-Florida Research and Education Center, located in Apopka, Florida. His research and extension program focuses on weed management and ornamental plants, both in production and in landscape plantings. And then we also have Dr. Emma Lookabaugh, and she is our BASF Senior Technical Specialist, and she covers turf and ornamentals for the southern region, and she currently lives in Raleigh, North Carolina. We will have a Q&A session at the end, but if you have any questions, please feel free to put those questions in the chat, and we'll be sure to cover those at the end. Dr. Chris Marble is up first, so if you could share your slides, I will let you take it away.
All right, we good? We can see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you all for tuning in, and thanks to BASF for inviting me to speak to you today. So so today I'm going to talk about probably the most challenging time to manage weeds in the nursery environment, and that's the summertime. We have a lot of challenges during the summertime, regardless of where you are, but specifically in the South. A lot of times we get higher rainfall, but the higher temperatures, and it can really bring on a lot of weed pressure. So we're going to talk about some ways to get over that and to develop good herbicide programs for that time of year specifically. So keys to stretching your herbicide dollars in the summer. So when I talk about herbicides, I always say you want a program, not just products. So you can go through and you can select the best products to use, but you need to know how to structure those into a program and a rotation so that you can get the best bang for your buck, basically, with those herbicides. And when I say, a herbicide program or a weed control program, what I mean by that is it's a planned but flexible schedule of herbicide applications. So, typically I'll recommend something like an 8-week rotation in between herbicide applications, especially during the summertime, and that's really regardless of where you're at. But if you start to see breakthrough earlier, or you still have really good weed control at 7-8 weeks, you could possibly extend that, but you need to stay ahead of the thing. You don't want to just wait to apply herbicides once you have outbreaks and things, because the name of the game is reducing hand weeding. Because really, regardless of your production practices or what you're growing, hand weeding is going to be, a huge cost, and definitely the most costly aspect of weed management. And definitely, if you look at the cost of a herbicide versus the cost of hand weeding, it's cents, on the dollar. But your herbicide application schedule and your rotations can be based upon crop tolerance, season and weed species at the time. So this presentation, I'll focus a lot on those summer species, like you have on the slide here, spurges and things like that. And then also paying attention to annual limits as well. With all of our herbicides, we're limited to a certain number of applications per year, depending upon the rate that you're using. But generally, that's 2 or 3 applications per year. So those products that are really strong on those summer weeds, make sure to structure your program where you can use those at the most opportune time for that. And then also base it upon your nursery. So I'm going to give some examples of some different rotations that might be used just based upon how to structure products together so that you're not using the same mode of action over and over again. But the rotations and things that I develop or that I'm showing examples of are just examples. So don't necessarily take those and think that they apply to your nursery, because it needs to be very specific. I do a lot of consulting at different nurseries and things, and I go all over Florida and develop herbicide programs for people, and I don't think I've ever recommended the same exact thing at two places because nobody really grows the same stuff or has the same weed issues. And then I say think of herbicides as individual tools. You just select the right tool for the right job, and it's the same thing with herbicides as well. But then also don't fix anything if it's not broken. So if you're having good success with what you're doing, don't necessarily take something that I'm going to say and change it because, I presented something. Again, all this stuff is very site specific and nursery specific. So benefits of good weed control rotations. You're going to get better weed control. Also, rotating products and not applying things sequentially all the time. It's going to also give you better crop tolerance as well. It improves plant safety. Oftentimes, with a lot of these species, what we see when we evaluate different rotations is that they can tolerate, a reasonable amount of one herbicide and a different active ingredient. Um, uh, Another herbicide and another active ingredient at a reasonable or labeled rate, as opposed to those back-to-back applications. So oftentimes we see better crop tolerance as well. And then, of course, we want to reduce the chances of resistance development. We're seeing this more and more in other types of cropping systems where we have a lot of wheat species that have developed rotations, but or has developed resistance rather. And so we want to avoid that and not use the same mode of actions too many times. And then the thing that I always say is the uncontrolled weed is going to take over. Like you have this case right here, crabgrass, took over because the grower was using a lot of herbicides that were weak on grasses. So what happens? That grass is going to take over. So rotating, using different products, and when those products are the most effective is going to give you the best results overall. So step one to developing a rotation for your program is knowing that control is important, and that's what we're really trying to do is control the weeds. But crop safety is going to be the primary concern, and that's typically the bottleneck, especially when you're talking about ornamentals, when you're selecting weed control programs. A lot of products have a lot of different plants that are listed on the label. I don't know how many, for example, Tower and Freehand have, but there's hundreds of plants on those labels where they've been tested and vetted, and that they're safe for application on those. But still, testing is key. So when you're ever using a herbicide for the first time, or you're applying it onto a new species or cultivar for the first time, doing some small scale testing, it seems like a hassle, but it can really provide a lot of benefits, and it ensures that herbicide is going to be safe and it's going to behave like you want it to. Because cultivar differences can occur. We've seen this, especially with some of the new cultivars. There's new cultivars that are released every year. And just because something's labeled for, Loropetalum chinense ruby, for example, it might not be safe on, a newer cultivar that's released. So it's always good to do some small scale testing. Site conditions can also differ. Everybody's going to water a little bit differently, fertilize a little bit differently, and have different challenges. And so it's good to just do some small scale testing before you make large scale applications. The summertime is actually a really good time to do this. Oftentimes I'll see people that are making these assessments and testing new herbicides out and looking to see if they're safe, and they'll apply them during the cooler times of the year. That's fine. And if you're going to apply the herbicide during that time of the year, that might be a good thing to do. But oftentimes, if you see that reduction in growth or you see that injury, it might not show up until that plant is really actively growing. So now is a great time to do some of this testing to see, how those herbicides are going to perform, because you're going to get the fastest growth typically with a lot of plants, and you're going to be able to see injury symptoms a lot quicker as well. So this is good. This is good. This is a good time to do that testing and see if things are going to work, to be able to select the best herbicides for your operation. So here's just an example of how to set up some testing. So this is at our research facility where we did some testing on some palms, a couple years ago, and it's basically just getting, 5 or 6 plants from the different species that you want to test and treating them with the different herbicides. This is a study that I set up at a nursery who was wanting to use some different liquid and granular formulations, and they were just starting to do some new cultivars of different things, and we're wanting to see, which herbicides and how well they performed. And so I just went out there and helped them kind of set up blocks, and we went out there and did the testing. Sure enough, a lot of those were safe, and we saw good results with those. And so they could take that, and then they could feel confident that they're going to be able to use, these herbicides on the new crops that they're growing or starting to put into their product lines. So this is just a list. I'll show this oftentimes, and it just shows the different herbicides and the ones that we have available to us. These are just our over-the-top options, and they're color-coded by mode of action. So you can take that and you can look at it and you can say, if I'm using a lot of these herbicides that are the same mode of action or the same, color scheme that I have on this chart here over and over and over again, I could potentially, induce some problems related to weed control or potentially crop tolerance. But you want to be able to rotate between those different active ingredients. So that's just something to keep in mind. You don't want to select just the same, mode of action group and apply it over and over again. It also shows you the ones that might not be great rotation partners. So you have a lot of these 3+21 combinations and these 3+14 combinations that are familiar combinations that people use and have good success with those, but they're not good. You wouldn't want to rotate Snapshot with Fortress with Gemini, for example. So because they're the same mode of action group, you'd want to throw something else in there to get potentially better control or crop safety or whatever you're doing and prevent resistance development. So when you're developing a herbicide rotation, know what your options are. And so this is, if I go back to that previous slide, I wanted to point out something. This 2017 Southeast Pest Control Guide for Nursery Crops and Landscape Planting. So that's where this page is taken from, is this guide. And I've developed these types of charts for different nurseries that I've gone out to and helped out with different issues. Or basically this, if you look in that guide, you have all the different plants, and then we have all the herbicides, and then whether it's labeled for use on that crop or not. So that doesn't necessarily, just because the crop isn't labeled doesn't mean you can't use that herbicide, but it does mean that you need to pay more attention and do that testing and everything. But you want to look at that, look and see, what all is labeled, what all are your options, and what herbicides that I can choose to go on this crop based upon the safety profile of that herbicide. So that's the number one step, is just figuring out what you can use from a crop safety standpoint. And then step two is knowing what weeds that you need to target. And that's going to be nursery specific. So this time of year, it's primarily spurge. Everybody that I talk to, whether you're talking about Florida or Oregon or California or wherever, spurge is typically their number one issue during the summer months. It could be different, in different places, in different specific nurseries. They might have one or other weeds that they're dealing with, but spurge is often the top one. But you want to make sure that you have herbicides that are going to be worse on that primary species. So in a lot of cases it's spurge, but then at the same time, you might have these secondary species, something like a calypta or crabgrass or philanthus or, whatever it is, that they're those secondary species. You also have those as a problem, but it's not as big as that primary species. Make sure the herbicide is very effective for that primary species, and it will also pick up or at least have some control on those secondary species as well. So that's how you want to go through and select your herbicides, and you take those from that list of herbicides that are safe and then go from there. So again, back to that 2017 pest control guide. So I just selected spotted spurge here. Then we have, whether the herbicide is ranked as good, fair, or poor. There's a lot of, company resources. BASF has a lot of good resources. A lot of other universities besides University of Florida, but Florida, I have a lot of resources where we have efficacy charts and things where you can go up and you can look at what herbicides are going to be effective for that weed spectrum that you have. So this is just an example rotation based upon that information. So say you were growing gardenias and you were trying to do spurge in the summertime. And then like in this case, you look at the month of the year and you have your top weed species or so, and then potential herbicide options. And this just goes to where you were doing 2 maximum applications of each herbicide. And you were targeting those primary species. So you can see here, bittercress might be an issue during the winter months. So you could pick stuff that's effective for that. But then when you get into the cooler months, May and on, I've got freehand in here twice. Freehand, then go on with something like Marengo G or something, and then coming back with freehand when spurge is still an issue. Dimethylamine P is one that we've seen to be consistently effective on spurge. It will even control very small germinating spurge. We've seen that in several studies. So with people battling spurge during the summer, I tell people, you could save those 2 freehand applications potentially for those months, get the spurge. There's a lot of other options and things that can be put in there, but that's an example of one way that you could do it. And then with liquid only programs, it becomes a lot more challenging because you go back to that chart that I showed, you don't have near as many liquid options that can be applied over the top. Spray only programs become more difficult, but you could do something like Tower followed by, a Soxamin containing product like a Gemini or Gallery, followed by another Tower application. Some people will add Pendulum in there and make it as a liquid freehand application. But you want to get something, if you're using the group 15 in Tower, have something different in there so you're not applying it back to back. Typically recommending getting those Tower applications during those warm months, just because in terms of the over-the-top options that are safe, it's going to be probably the strongest thing that we have that can be applied over the top of different things. But again, feel free to email me, and I'll have my contact information at the end, and I can help you with more of a customizable program for your operation. Another thing too that I wanted to point out during the summer months is that crop injury is of top concern. Plants are just with our applications, especially when you're talking about liquid programs. We can see higher instances of this transient injury, especially on growing. Plants are almost always constantly flushing during the summertime, where you have that lush, sensitive new growth. One way to potentially alleviate that and to reduce that is to apply irrigation immediately after that herbicide application has been made. Some nurseries will even do this where they're making their liquid application, and while that boom is going out and spraying that, they'll be running irrigation over the top of that to wash that off the foliage, and you can reduce that injury quite a bit doing that way, if injury is a concern or it's a kind of a plant that's marginal. So just some general guidelines on summer rotations. A lot of stuff is effective, and different combinations can be effective. It's going to be nursery and ornamental and weed species specific. If you've got something that you're using during the summer months and are having really good success with it, minimal hand weeding, definitely don't jump to change it. But if you are having consistent breakthroughs, battling things, it likely means that you have either a herbicide selection issue or an application issue. And so just some different things that pair well with your freehand applications and your Tower applications during those summer months with some different mode of action groups, different freehand partners on the granular side, something like Marengo, OH2, Biathlon, and then Tower. Again, you don't have very many options, from a liquid standpoint, but Gallery is a different mode of action. Barricade, Pendulum, Dimension are all group 3s. So that's different than Tower as well. But a lot of times with liquids, it's just finding, options to use and enough of those to use throughout the year. So field in-ground operations, I've talked a lot about containers, but it's really the same thing, same principles are going to apply. But you do have two additional herbicide options, SureGuard and Moringa. That can be applied as directed applications. They're not safe as over-the-top applications for most things. But you also need to plan for sedge management. Dimethylamine P, tower, freehand, they're going to give you some good yellow nut sedge suppression. Here's just an example of that of a trial that we did last summer. You have all these herbicides. This is a control group, and then different applications of tower and freehand at their labeled rates, and significant, over 9% at this stage reduction in yellow nut sedge emergence. So saw really good control with that trial. You're typically not going to get 100% nut sedge suppression, but you can get pretty good suppression and really reduce competition from sedge, which is definitely a management issue. The other group 15, peanut magnum, can give you sedge suppression as well. And then just application intervals. It's going to depend upon where you're at and kind of your production practices and things. 8 weeks on average, but you want to stay ahead of that. Don't wait until the control begins to break to make that follow-up application. I like to show this slide. So this was, we looked at 9 different rotation programs when we kept it at an 8-week interval or less. So basically, I think the lowest that we did was 6, but most of these applications were made at that 8-week interval. And then if you look at the control of these wheat species that we looked at with the first, second, and third application, our control actually increased over time. When we decreased the application frequency to 10 to 12 weeks, the control in a lot of cases started to decrease over time, where by that third application, we were getting less control than we got with that first application. And that's because our seed bank is increasing. By the time we get to 12 weeks, you're going to get breakthrough with a lot of these herbicides. You have higher seed load. And so over time, the weed control becomes weaker and weaker, and those herbicides perform less, as opposed to getting these pre-emergence herbicides out onto to clean soil. One thing that I'm doing too, so I talked a lot about the different herbicide options that are available. One thing that I'm looking at now is looking at ways to improve application efficiency. We have great herbicide options, but oftentimes the bottleneck is getting those out in time. And so one thing I've been doing is going around to nurseries throughout the country and looking at the different ways that people are applying herbicides and trying to learn from them, see how efficient, different forms of application are, so that when I go to other nurseries, I can share with them information. A lot of the challenges that people have are just getting these herbicides out in time, and then they blame it on the herbicide. But really, the application was delayed, or they didn't have the labor to put it out. And so we can improve that by improving our applications. And so we're looking at everything from handshakers to, big boom sprayers to see how efficient they are, learn what people are doing, and learn how we can help other nurseries be more efficient with their herbicide applications. One thing that we've seen with this, and we've kind of backed this up with research, is that with liquids especially, increasing the application volume can really improve results. People often go out with lower application volumes because these labels will say you can go at a wide range of application volumes. And if the plants are small, that's typically fine. But if you have dense plants, you can see the coverage that we're getting on the soil surface with 25 gallons per acre, 50 gallons per acre, 100, and then 200, which is kind of excessive. That's a lot of water. But you can see that especially when you get to 100, you're getting much better coverage and penetration of that spray through the plant canopy. So if you're going with those lower application volumes and you have a very dense ornamental, it might not be the herbicide that didn't work. It might just be application volume needs to increase. Another thing, I talked about irrigation to improve the crop safety. Irrigation right after treatment can also improve control. So This is, a range of different application volumes with herbicide. And then this is letting the herbicide dry on the plants for 4 hours before it's washed off the foliage. And this is irrigating. Basically, the plants were treated and then immediately irrigated. And you can see that the control is much better on this side. None of that herbicide was allowed to dry on the plant foliage, wash down. You have much better coverage of that herbicide on the soil surface, and it resulted in much better weed control. So we're looking at all these different things and different application practices, everything from belly grinder spreaders to drones and stuff. If you're interested in participating or having me out to do any kind of to help you with using herbicides more effectively and helping you with efficiency or evaluating new types of herbicide application equipment, or going to liquids or converting to sprays or whatever you're doing, I'm more than happy to work with you, and I can help you develop different types of programs, show you what's safe and everything. A lot of time, I'll just do this for anybody that sends me their crop list. I can send them, all the different herbicides that are labeled, and help them. And if I come out and visit and you allow me to take some of that efficiency data, I have developed, different rotation programs for people. And so this is a example spray liquid program and a granular program that I developed for someone based upon their list. And I have the different products and, ranked 1, 2, 3, depending upon their situation and what they were trying to use. I also do a weed management course. This is what we did in 25, but I'll offer it again in 26 too, where it's a 4-week course, and we just go over everything related to weed control in nurseries. Feel free to reach out and I can give you more information on that. This is my all my contact information. Feel free to reach out if I can ever help with anything. And I also, again, I want to thank BASF for supporting a lot of the research that I do, and for the opportunity to speak today. And with that, I guess we'll go to Emma, and then I will hang around for any questions at the end. But thank you very much for your time and attention.
All right, awesome, Chris. Okay, let me share my screen. All right, so for the last half of this presentation, we're going to talk about disease control or summer disease control in nurseries. So when it comes to summertime and diseases that we typically encounter, really the leaf spot diseases, foliar diseases, pretty much reign supreme. So you've got spores flying around, splashing around. You've got overhead irrigation and rainfall throughout the summer months. You've got some wind picks up and helps move those spores around. And then to add on top of that, we have heat. And whenever we have, hot plants, those plants are going to be more stressed. And when plants are more stressed, they're more susceptible to disease. So kind of all these things come together and we start seeing fungal leaf spots primarily on a lot of the crops that we grow in outdoor nursery settings. So, we get asked a lot. I get sent pictures all the time. Hey, what is this leaf spot? What's wrong with my plants? What do you think this is? And so I get a lot of pictures. And sometimes it's really easy to tell you exactly which leaf spot you have and what the best way to control that is. But sometimes when we get leaf spots, it's a little more difficult to figure out, is this leaf spot caused by Cercospora? Is it caused by Septoria? Is it an anthracnose disease? Is it even a fungal leaf spot? Sometimes we deal with bacterial leaf spot. And so it can be a little bit tricky. And so when we think about, scouting our plants and trying to figure out if we actually have disease issues starting, the best thing I say to do is make sure you're looking at your plants often, and you're scouting well, and you're not just looking out over the top canopy. Because when it comes to a lot of the diseases that sneak up on us, they tend to start on the lower leaves or even like inside the canopy where it's a little bit more humid. But definitely you'll start seeing the initial symptoms on the lower leaves. And a lot of that is because a lot of the inoculum that we're dealing with in nursery settings is it's actually coming up either from the media, from the debris on the ground, or from the soil that these pots are underneath. And so you'll see a lot of the early infections on the lower leaves because that's where it's closer to that source of inoculum. And then as the summer progresses, a lot of these fungal leaf spots produce like sticky splash dispersed spores. So every time a drop of water hits one of those lesions, it sends a plume of spores to all of your nearby leaf tissue. And then those spores are able to infect if that leaf is not protected with a fungicide. And so that's why you'll start seeing, these little concentrated areas where disease starts and then it spreads out from there. And so the better you are at scouting, we can kind of contain those disease outbreaks before you get widespread spread across multiple, plants. The other thing when it comes to fungal diseases is most of the time, it really isn't all that important to know if I've got septoria or if I've got cercospora, because if I am able to build a comprehensive spray program, comprehensive rotation with good fungicides, usually if you pick broad spectrum fungicides, they're going to be able to control most of the fungal leaf spots that you're going to encounter. There are some one-offs where you need more specialized products, but for the most part, if you've identified, hey, this is a fungus, and you pick a good broad spectrum fungicide, you're going to be able to get some good protection and some good control. Things that you want to look for to be able to tell if you have a fungus versus, say, a bacterial leaf spot, you're going to look at the lesions themselves and the signs that are on the plant. So a lot of times, if you see red or purple margins, like you can see in this photo here on hydrangeas, that's a good clue that you have a fungal leaf spot. The other thing that is kind of really classic diagnostic is if that lesion starts graying out or bleaching out in the center. And as it ages, you'll even sometimes see these little black pinprick looking spots in the center of the lesion. And so if you get out your hand lens and you look at that up close, it looks like these little raised black bumps in the center of that leaf spot. And so that's actually the fungal fruiting body and where the spores are going to be released from. So if you ever see that type of sign on your leaves, it's a good clue that you've got a fungal leaf spot disease. The symptoms can vary across hosts. So there's cercospora diseases have a pretty wide host range. They occur on a lot of different ornamental plants. And depending on if you're on hydrangea or another host, sometimes those lesions, sometimes those spots might look a little different. Sometimes they're more purple, sometimes they're more red. But the key is, identifying, hey, I do have a problem. It looks like a fungal or a biotic problem. And I need to intervene and I need to start spraying some fungicides. So just looking at some of, the differences in what it can look like on, or what these, fungal leaf spots can look like. I've got kind of a slideshow here showing some different things and some things to watch for. Here's a leaf spot. This one's called Cylindrosporum. I think now they've changed the name to Bloomiarella. So again, you can see those red lesions. They kind of have a darker outer margin. You can see some of those pinprick spots if you look really close in the center of those lesions. And again, on first glance, depending on where they show up, it can be easy to overlook some of these. If you're down in Florida or anywhere in the South where we can grow tropical plants in the nursery and then also in the landscape, anthracnose is a huge deal and very difficult to control. So these are some Sansevieria, and the thing I want to note on these lesions is you're going to see, if you look closely, almost like a bullseye or concentric ring pattern happening. And then you can also see all those little pinprick fruiting bodies. And so that's where all the spores are going to be released. And so anytime you see this concentric ring pattern, that's a good clue that you have a fungus, because what happens is you have a spore that lands on the leaf, it infects the leaf, and it starts colonizing that leaf tissue. The plant is trying to like stop that fungus from invading, and it tries to wall off the fungus from expanding further into the leaf. And so it gets a little bit of the upper hand, it stops it. Well, then the fungus is able to advance a little further, and then the plant does it again. So every time you have a ring, it's basically where that plant is trying to stop or wall off the pathogen, the fungus, from further colonizing the leaf tissue. If you let this go, you can get lesions that span almost the whole leaf. And when we deal with crops that don't lose their leaves, unfortunately, this massively affects the aesthetic value, right? Because you're going to be left looking at those lesions basically until you cut those leaves off, because they don't fall off on their own. And so it's really ugly, and it decreases our marketability of these plants. And so this is why when we think about leaf spots, preventative fungicide applications, even when you think, hey, I'm clean, I don't have disease going, you should be making regular fungicide applications in a preventative manner so that you never see the leaf spots before they happen. Because the problem with these leaf spots, not only is they reduce marketability, but they also can really sneak up on you. And all of a sudden, if you have a week of like hot, rainy weather, they blow up and they spread all over the place, and you're left with a big mess, and you start having to like actually throw away plants at that point. So really scouting and paying close attention, not just to like what you're seeing on the top, but actually getting down in there and seeing, do I have lesions near the crown? Do I have lesions at the base of the plant or the lower leaves? This is another one. You can just see, again, that concentric ring pattern, and it all depends on where that spore lands on the leaf as to where you start seeing the symptom. The other thing with a lot of leaf spots is sometimes they can be confused with, mechanical injury, dieback, high salts, or just like sunburn. And so you're looking for those other signs to be able to tell, like, is this really a fungus causing this problem, or do I have some other issue that I have to deal with? Unfortunately, too, sometimes, especially in the case with sunburn or sun scald, is you'll end up with the damage from the sun and sun scald, and then you end up with secondary fungi that come in and sort of start feeding on that dead and dying tissue. And so every once in a while, you can kind of be tricked into thinking like, oh, I've got a real disease issue here, but really the original cause was that abiotic injury. So it can get a little tricky. The reason why we control these is, like I said, some of them are just prolific spore producers. So things like anthracnose, or in this photo, this is actually one called Intimasporium leaf spot on Indian hawthorns. And I don't think you can grow Indian hawthorn, especially not once it goes into the landscape, where you don't eventually get Intimasporium leaf spot. It is very destructive. And throughout the course of the summer, you're just going to start seeing more and more lesions. And then eventually some of these leaf spot diseases can actually cause defoliation. So they get bad enough that all the leaves start dropping off, and it just looks really unsightly. The other thing too is, every time a leaf falls onto the ground, that is just a source of inoculum. So the longer you let that leaf sit in the pot or on the ground around those pots, anytime you irrigate or get water splashing, there's just spores continually being produced in that leaf tissue that fell on the ground, and then is going to spread up to, healthy leaves nearby. And so later we'll talk about, in addition to fungicides, how do you deal with this? And sanitation is one of the major ways that we can, really reduce the level of disease we have in the nursery. Like I mentioned, sometimes it is tricky to see these. And so if I was just looking at the top of this plant, I would think all is well. But if I really get in there, I can see that there's actually quite a bit of disease on the interior and the lower leaves, the lower foliage. So again, it can kind of sneak up on you. And I think that's why managing leaf spots in the nursery, especially in the summer, becomes really challenging. It's not because we don't have great fungicides and fungicides that will control almost all of these diseases. It's because we're constantly playing catch up and we're behind the power curve. And so, if you're constantly trying to go in a more curative sense, it's just harder to keep up and stay on top of your spray intervals, and, really reduce the spread. Certain hosts, it becomes a little bit tricky. And that's why, sometimes if you ever are in doubt whether or not you have a fungal leaf spot or maybe even something like downy mildew, it's always good to send in a sample to your local university or your local extension office, because they have people that can help diagnose and identify what's actually happening. Because in some cases, if you pick the wrong fungicide, you're not going to get the control that you want. So, in this picture, we actually have black spotted rose, but anyone who grows roses knows that every once in a while, we also have to deal with downy mildew. And sometimes the symptoms look really similar. And to get really good downy mildew control, we would probably want a downy mildew or an oomycete specialist in our rotation to really maximize that control. And so, there are times where, yes, getting a diagnosis and actually confirming what disease you have is really important so that you can pick a more effective fungicide. And in the long run, that's going to save you money because you're picking a product that's going to work for the disease that you are dealing with. They can look different on everything. So here's another anthracnose disease. This is on azaleas. And I remember one summer we got multiple locations that had these symptoms on their azaleas. And on first glance, everyone was thinking it was a bacterial leaf spot. And a lot of these, when we sent them in for diagnosis at the clinic, it actually came back anthracnose, and we're able to find the spores. And so, realize that, because obviously, like if this had been a bacterial disease, we would obviously need, a completely different set of products to control a bacterial disease as opposed to anthracnose fungus. So here it is, an anthracnose on azalea. Here's an anthracnose on boxwoods. Boxwoods are the ones everyone is always afraid of, right? Like if you see a leaf spot on your boxwood, you get scared because boxwood blight is out there. And we all know in the past, what happened when we ended up with boxwood blight. It creates a major headache from a regulatory perspective, from a containment perspective. And so, whenever you see that, you immediately go worst case scenario. And sometimes it is hard to be able to tell, like, is this anthracnose? Is this a different leaf spot? Or is it actually, boxwood blight? So again, going back to the when in doubt, send it in if you want to. And more importantly, kind of treat this as let's contain and destroy the affected plants before we are dealing with sort of a massive outbreak. Because the biggest thing to remember when it comes to managing some of these diseases, especially the, more destructive diseases, is it's a lot cheaper to throw away a handful of plants early on than it is to throw away an entire section of plants later. And so, throughout the production cycle, you're not only applying fungicides, you're applying insecticides, you're putting a lot of fertilizer out there, you're putting a lot of labor and herbicides out there, you're hand weeding. So there's a lot of money invested in these plants. And so the more often you scout and can catch things really early, the better off it's going to be, because You don't want situations like this where you have larger areas of disease, because the reality is pretty much all of those plants in that area are probably already infected in some way. And maybe not the ones, towards the back, but definitely all those plants in the foreground. This particular situation, they not only had a foliar anthracnose issue, they also had Phytophthora root rot that they were dealing with. And so very quickly, these diseases can spread, and move pretty rapidly. And so whenever you're, dealing with something like this, it's best to trash the, hot spot and then treat all of the surrounding plants that look healthy where you don't see any symptoms. Go ahead and treat those with fungicides and then continue with those preventative applications so that hopefully, even if something was already infected, you don't ever see the symptoms. I remember one time there, reading something where the amount of disease you have is pretty significant before you ever see the first symptom or sign of a disease. And so you already have infection, you already have colonization through the leaf, colonization through the root, before you ever see like a yellowing or a lesion or, the rot starting out. And so there's this window between when infection happens and when you actually see the symptom. And sometimes that window can be pretty long. And so that whole time, that pathogen is spreading to nearby plants before you ever even know it. And again, that goes back to why we should all be on just like preventative fungicide programs. So kind of going into that, how do we manage this? How do we bring all this together to effectively manage leaf spots in the summer months when we have, rain, heat, overhead irrigation, fungi everywhere, stressed plants everywhere. And so the biggest things are you protect them with fungicides, you try to manage that stress as best you can, and then you keep the areas clean. So sanitation goes probably the longest, or the furthest when we talk about managing diseases and also managing weeds, right? Like sanitation goes really far in keeping everything clean and also using less products ultimately because you have good sanitation practices. So when we think about fungicides and how we pick fungicides, the most important thing to remember is fungicides aren't medicines in the sense that we think about, Tylenol or something like that. They're more like the armor that protects the plant. And so when you think about it that way, you have to make decisions about how you apply those products so that you're getting maximum efficacy, and then how often you have to reapply. And so it's good to kind of have some basic understanding of how these products work. So if we want maximum protection, we want to apply that protective layer, that protective fungicide, where the pathogen is actively infecting. So if we have a foliar disease that we want to control, we want to spray that product on the leaves so that you have the maximum concentration of fungicide on the leaf tissue. If you're trying to control Phytophthora or a root disease, you should really be drenching those products into the root zone, because that way you have the most product being actively absorbed by the roots and also present in the root zone where the pathogen is moving and infecting the root tips. And so, yes, we do have products that move systemically or are locally systemic, but you still want to maximize that concentration, because most of our products, even if they're systemic, they're not truly systemic in that they move both up and down in the plant. And the other thing to remember is, as it moves systemically, the concentration across all of that tissue decreases. And so you want products that actually stay in a high concentration where you put them, because those are the products that are ultimately going to give you a longer lasting residual. So here's an example of what is a locally systemic or penetrant type fungicide, what that actually looks like. So this is a leaf cell And so the green is the leaf. The blue is the fungicide. And so this particular fungicide is one of our fungicides, and it actively binds to the waxy layer on the leaf cells. And so it binds tightly and it stays in fairly high concentration, bound to that waxy layer. So yes, you get some localized penetration, localized movement, but you have really nice even coverage across that whole leaf surface. And that's really important because when we think about protecting the plant, we want it to be a barrier to infection. So if a spore lands on it, we don't want that spore to be able to penetrate and start colonizing the plant tissue. We also want that fungicide to penetrate into the cells because we want to prevent anything that was already colonizing the plant. We don't want it to be able to sporulate on the leaf tissue afterwards. And so that's what fungicides do. They can actually prevent colonization. And so I really like this photo because it shows you, hey, this spaghetti looking stuff in this picture, that's actually a fungal, that's the fungus. That's the fungal mycelium, the hyphae as it colonizes the plant cell. And so really effective fungicides are able to even get into the plant cell and kill any fungal hyphae that has already started colonizing it. Other ones just kind of slow down that colonization, but can't actually or aren't as effective at killing what's already inside the plant. And this is also why when you go out in a curative application, sometimes you have to keep applying or you have to apply more often because it takes more product to kill what's inside the leaf tissue and also protect the outer layer from new infections and new colonization. So when we think about curative applications and leaf spot diseases, curative is kind of a funny term because if you've got a leaf spot that's already caused lesions all over your leaves, like in this picture, this is pittosporum, in an alternaria leaf spot, you're going to look at that leaf spot until those leaves fall off. It's never going to go away. But you apply a fungicide and it kills whatever fungus is in the leaf and it prevents further infection and further spread, and it makes sure that all your new growth is infection free, but you're still going to look at the old lesions. And so, you know, curative, yeah, we killed the fungus and we prevented, you know, additional disease, but it doesn't miraculously get rid of those lesions. It doesn't grow that tissue back. It doesn't turn that brown dead tissue green again. And so preventative, again, you know, if we take away anything from today, is you want the preventative side. You want to be regularly applying these fungicides, whether you see disease or not, so that you never ever see disease in your nursery. That's kind of the ideal. So when we think about, you know, designing a spray program and a spray rotation, you don't need a million products. You don't need to buy, you know, 20 different products, 20 different fungicides. I know you're, you know, bombarded with all these different products all the time from different manufacturers. But the reality is, if you pick a strong, comprehensive program, but you're smart about it, you really only need a handful of products to cover you for most of the foliar diseases that you'll encounter. And so typically when we write programs for somebody, you know, we start with our foundation application. So we pick one of the fungicides that has a super broad spectrum of control, covers you for a wide range of diseases, gives you that penetrant local systemic activity, and sets you up for a strong season. And so something like Orchestra or Pillar, combination products that have more than one active ingredient, those are great products for your foundation because they give you that spectrum of control. Then you pick a rotation partner. So it's good to pick, you know, another broad spectrum rotation partner, something like a DMI, like a Velio, or there are others. And that's kind of your like go-to, I've got my foundation and my partner product. Then for resistance management, you pick one of the utility fungicides. So you may like chlorothalonil, Some people don't like chlorothalonil, so they're going to pick mancozeb or they're going to pick T-methyl. This will vary depending on, whether you have residue issues you're worried about, or, what crops you're growing, but you pick one of those utility fungicides. And then you make sure you've got a specialist product on the shelf available when you need it. So if you're growing crops that, always get downy mildew, you're going to want to have a downy mildew product. So something like Stature or Vago or Segovis. If you're growing, mums or poinsettias or, something that gets a lot of pythium, then you're going to want a pythium specialist. So you're going to put something like Segway on your shelf. If you're growing stuff that you always have botrytis, then you would maybe want to have something like Decree that basically only controls botrytis and nothing else. So it's always good to at least have a specialist on hand for if you need it. But that sort of just rounds out your program. So, that's just a really simple way to get this broad spectrum rotation that's going to cover you for all these different diseases, especially all of the foliar diseases. And so this is kind of what a really simple rotation looks like that is rotating you through multiple modes of action. So if you count them up here, we've got, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, like at least 6 different modes of action that we're rotating through. And that's going to control most of our diseases. So it doesn't have to be complicated. The other thing to remember is whenever you have, heavy disease pressure, you want to tighten your spray intervals. So, most products, if you're using systemics and penetrant products, you can get 14 days out of those products. Contact fungicides like chlorothalonil, you may only be getting 7 to 10 days out of that product. And so it really does vary depending on, what your disease pressure looks like, what your environmental conditions are. Is it really rainy? Am I getting a lot of, rain? Is it really hot? Are my fungicides not going to last as long in those situations? So you want to tighten those intervals a little bit. But, bringing that all together, we really can control diseases and get a better handle on diseases. So you have the fungicide aspect, and then we bring in, the cultural control. So cleaning up all of that inoculum and the debris. So anytime you go through and prune, making sure we're dealing with all that debris and we're not spreading it around. We're picking it up before you're able to get a lot of disease spread. Unfortunately, overhead irrigation is the best thing in terms of spreading fungal diseases. And so if we could eliminate overhead irrigation, yeah, you probably wouldn't have any foliar diseases to deal with. But, we can't do that. We've got to overhead irrigate. That's pretty much how everyone does it. And so just recognizing that, when you're doing a lot of overhead irrigation, especially in the summer when it's super hot and you're having to water a lot more, recognize that your fungicide applications are not going to last as long as they would if it was a drier period. Drip irrigation is ideal, but most people don't have setups like this. So the reality is, again, just trying to manage our irrigation and kind of making sure we're using good protective fungicides that are rain fast and have, a good level of control. The other thing about managing diseases is just managing plant stress and reducing plant stress. So whether it's, the pot color that you're choosing, how close you space them together, all of these can have effects on that root zone temperature and the overall quality of the plant. And so, little things like this that can be big changes in your nursery can make a huge impact on just overall quality, especially as we're dealing with, the heat of the summer. And kind of like with that plant stress, that's why we recommend our intrinsic brand fungicides, because these fungicides, in addition to killing the fungal pathogens, they also have positive effects on plant metabolism and real plant health benefits. And so when you're using them regularly in your production cycle, We're seeing, increase in photosynthesis. We're seeing reduced nighttime respiration. So we see more carbon, more nitrogen available for plant growth. And what that looks like is bigger roots, greener leaves, stronger stems. So if you're regularly using Pageant, Orchestra, and even Pillar SC, you're going to see a difference in the overall quality of your plants. And so, I love pictures like this that growers send us, where they just do side by sides of, treated versus untreated. And really the photos speak for themselves. You get, increased growth, nice greener color, increased root growth when you're regularly using these products. And all of that also leads to enhanced stress tolerance. So we see a decrease in ethylene production. And so as a result, we have better performance under drought stress and heat stress. And so we've done, lots of trials to kind of show how these products perform when the conditions of the production conditions are very challenging. So if you want to protect your plants from not only diseases in the summer, but also all of that summer stress, apply intrinsic brand fungicides, good fungicides, try to reduce the stress when you can. And then the biggest thing is, actually trash the disease stuff. So if you've got root rot, you've got widespread leaf spot diseases, you've got anthracnose, get rid of some of those plants that are heavily infested, heavily infected, and, protect the nearby plants to reduce the spread. So that's, I think we're kind of at the top of the hour, but this is a link to the BASF website where you'll find more information about, the products I talked about today and that Chris talked about today. But I think, we can stay on a little bit for questions. I got to go see if I can find the chat and see if there's any questions in the chat. But, thanks everyone. And hopefully, the summer isn't too bad. It's shaping up, I feel like, to be really rough. I mean, that's what it seems like. We're, dealing with drought conditions and it's already super hot. So I guess we'll see what comes this summer, but I think it's going to be a hot one for sure.
Awesome. Thank you, Emma and Chris. If you have any questions, please feel free to either come off mute and you can ask directly, or you can drop your questions either in the chat or in the Q&A. We did have one question a little while ago. Emma, they were asking what's a good diagnostic clinic to use. So I don't know if you have any recommendations to share with the group.
Yeah, so most of your land-grant universities that have extension departments have a diagnostic lab. So University of Florida has a great diagnostic lab. NC State's got one. Purdue has a really nice ornamental diagnostic lab. And so usually, you can start with your local extension office, and they can direct you to a lab, or you can, contact if you've got an issue, contact your local sales rep and we can help work out, figuring out what's wrong as well. But most of the universities have really nice diagnostic labs. And if you use one in your state, it's really affordable. If you start sending them to other states, the prices do go up a little bit. So I would say always try to start with your local lab and then go elsewhere if you need to.
All right. Thank you. Also, if you're having trouble coming off mute, feel free to raise your hand and I can manually unmute you. But otherwise, the only other question was if the slides would be available. We are planning to send out the recording of the webinar, so everyone should be able to see them that way. Well, all right then. I think that's everything. Emma and Chris, again, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for putting together this fantastic webinar. And everyone have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.